Girl vanished in 1990. 22 years later, Dad flips through the old yearbook and notices the dust motes danced in the single beam of late afternoon sun slanting through the attic window. A silent, swirling galaxy around Frank Carver's head. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound in the forgotten space. 22 years. 22 years since the attic, like his life, had been sealed, preserving the relics of a time before the silence. Before Leanne, his wife, Mary, had been gone for 6 months now, claimed by a quiet, merciless cancer that had been almost a relief after 2 decades of loud, merciless grief. It was her final whispered request that sent him up here. Clean it out, Frank. Let the light in. But he knew it wasn't about the attic. It was about him. He pulled open a cardboard box marked Leanne's school. The scent of old paper and dried glue rushed out. A ghost on the stale air, report cards, art, projects, a lock of honey blonde hair from her first haircut tied with a faded pink ribbon. And at the bottom, the Northgate Academy, annual for 1990, the Griffin. He ran a trembling hand over the embossed crest on the cover. He hadn't looked at it since the police returned it to him, their faces a mask of professional pity. Leanne had vanished on a Tuesday in May, 2 weeks before graduation. One moment she was there, a vibrant, defiant supernova of a girl, burning too bright for their small town. The next, she was gone. No note, no body, no answers, just a void that had swallowed his world whole. He sat on a dusty trunk, the yearbook, heavy in his lap, its spine cracking as he opened it. There they were, the smiling, privileged faces of Northgate's class of 1990, frozen in time. Kids who had gone on to become doctors, lawyers, senators. Kids who had families, kids who had lived. He turned the pages slowly, a pilgrimage through a past that felt like someone else's life. Page after page of forced smiles and inside jokes, in neat, looping cursive, stay cool, too cool to be forgotten. And then he saw her, page 84. The debate club, Leanne, front and center, her chin held high, that familiar spark of defiance in her eyes. It was a look that said, I dare you. He felt the familiar pang, a phantom limb aching for a lost piece of himself. He'd stared at this photo 1,000 times in the days and months after she disappeared, searching for some clue, some hint in her expression. Had she been happy? Scared? But he'd found nothing. Just his Leanne, beautiful and gone. His thumb brushed against the glossy page. He was about to close the book, the ritual of pain complete, when something snagged his attention. It wasn't Leanne, it was the background. The photo was taken in the school's oak-paneled library. Behind the row of students, through the large arched window, you could see the manicured green of the main quad. And on the gravel path that wound through it, something his heart gave a strange, painful lurch. He squinted. It was just a blur. Of color, indistinct. Probably a groundskeeper's cart, or another student walking by. It meant nothing. But he couldn't look away. The attic grew colder, the sunbeam fading. He fumbled for the string on the bare overhead bulb, flooding the space in a harsh yellow light. He held the page closer, his breath fogging the glossy surface. The photo was high quality for its time. The details were there, if you knew how to look. He'd spent his life as a watchmaker, his eyes trained to see the minuscule, the overlooked, the hidden mechanics of things. And his eyes were telling him that this wasn't just a blur. He scrambled through a nearby box, his hands shaking, until he found it. His watchmaker's loop. He screwed the small magnifier into his eye socket. The familiar pressure, a strange comfort. He brought the yearbook up to his face, the world shrinking to a single, grainy circle of light. The blur resolved. It wasn't a groundskeeper's cart. It was a car, a dark green sedan, parked half-hidden behind the ancient oak tree at the edge of the quad. A car had no business being on that path. It was strictly for pedestrians. He adjusted the focus, his breath catching in his throat. In the back window of the sedan, a tiny pinprick of reflected light glinted. And inside that reflection, distorted but horribly, undeniably clear, was a face. A man's face, turned away from the window, looking towards the library. And next to him, a flash of blonde hair. But it was the man's profile that made the air leave Frank's lungs in a rush. The sharp, aristocratic nose, the silvering hair, at the temples, the arrogant set of the jaw, a face he knew as well as his own, a face that had offered him condolences, a firm handshake, and a check for a new, fruitless search effort, all while looking him straight in the eye. Judge Harrison Blackwell. And then Frank saw the other thing. The thing that made a low guttural sound tear from his own throat. A small detail on the car itself, a custom touch he remembered from town parades and charity events. A small circular silver emblem on the trunk. The Blackwell family crest. His mind, numb for 22 years, suddenly roared to life. Blackwell's son, Marcus, had been in that debate club. He was standing 2 people down from Leanne in the very same photo. His arm draped casually around another girl, a smirk playing on his lips. Marcus, the golden boy, the town prince, who Leanne had once described as having the eyes of a snake in a Gucci suit. Frank looked from the judge's reflection to Marcus's smirking face, then to his daughter's defiant gaze. A cold, terrible logic began to connect the dots, a constellation of darkness that had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades. The judge's car, where it shouldn't have been. His son, a few feet away. His daughter, gone forever, just days. Later, the yearbook slipped from his numb fingers and landed with a soft thud on the dusty floorboards. The shock was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him, but it was followed by something else. Something he hadn't felt since 1990. A white-hot volcanic rage. They hadn't just lost her, they had taken her. And they had smiled in his face. While he wept, the question wasn't if. The question that screamed in the sudden roaring silence of the attic was why. And what, in God's name, was he going to do about it now? The man in the photograph wasn't just a wealthy alumnus anymore. He was a federal judge, one of the most powerful men in the state, wrapped in layers of influence and untouchable prestige. Frank Carver was just a small-town watchmaker with a broken heart and a 20-year-old photograph. It was an impossible fight. But as he looked at his daughter's face one last time, at that brave, unyielding chin, he knew he didn't have a choice. He had to let the light in, even if it burned everything to the ground. The past wasn't a foreign country. It was a crime scene, and Frank was walking back into it. His first stop was the home of a ghost. Detective Millerut, now of course, had been the lead on Leanne's case. A good man, Frank remembered, but a man who had seemed to hit a wall so hard it had broken his spirit. He lived in a small bungalow on the other side of town, the garden overgrown, the paint peeling. A place where a man went to be forgotten. Frank knocked, the sound echoing hollowly. Miller opened the door a crack, his face a roadmap of broken capillaries and disappointment. He looked older than his 68 years. When he saw Frank, his eyes, roomy and sad, widened for a second, before the old, tired mask of pity fell back into place. "Frank," he rasped, his voice gravelly with disuse. "It's been a long time." "I need to talk to you, Jim," Frank said, his voice steadier than he felt. He held up the yearbook, about Leanne. Miller's shoulders slumped. He opened the door wider. "There's nothing left to say." The inside of the house smelled of stale coffee and regret. Files and old newspapers were stacked on every surface, a hoarder's monument to a life of unsolved mysteries. Frank saw a faded photo on the mantelpiece. Miller, in his crisp uniform. An arm around a smiling wife who had left him years ago, unable to live with the ghosts he brought home from work. Leanne's was the ghost that had stayed. They closed the case. "Cold," Miller said, sinking into a worn armchair. "You know that." "It was never cold," Frank said, his voice low and intense. He opened the yearbook to page 84, and laid it on the coffee table between them. He handed Miller the watchmaker's loop. "Look, in the window." "The car." Miller sighed, a long weary exhalation of a man who'd been asked to hope one too many times. But he took the loop, his professional curiosity a muscle that had never fully atrophied. He leaned over the book, his breathing shallow. Frank watched his face, saw the flicker of annoyance give way to confusion, then to a sharp, sudden intake of breath. Miller looked up, the loop dropping from his eye. The blood had drained from his face. "My God," he whispered. "The Blackwell crest." Harrison Blackwell, Frank stated, the name like poison on his tongue. His son was in the club. "You remember Marcus?" Miller's eyes were distant, scanning the cluttered archives of his memory. Marcus Blackwell, the golden boy, had an alibi tighter than a drum. Said he was with his girlfriend, then at a team dinner. The girlfriend, Tiffany, confirmed it. Everyone confirmed it. "We talked to him. He was broken up about Leanne," said. "She was a sweet girl." "Leanne hated him," Frank said flatly. "She said he was a predator. She was writing an article about him for the school paper. About his untouchable status." He remembered a conversation, one he'd dismissed as teenage drama at the time. Leanne, pacing in the kitchen, her face flushed with righteous anger. "He thinks he can get away with anything, Dad, because of who his father is. It's not right. Someone has to say something." Miller ran a hand over his face. "An article the school never mentioned an article. They said she was a good student, a bit of a loner. They gave us her locker contents. Textbooks, a half-eaten candy bar. Nothing, of course." "They didn't," Frank spat. "The Blackwells practically owned that school. A scholarship kid accusing the son of their biggest benefactor, they would have buried it." "They did bury it." The old detective stared at the photograph, at the tiny, damning reflection. Frank could see the gears turning, the old instincts firing up. He saw the shame of a man realizing he'd been played, that the wall he'd hit hadn't been a dead end, but a carefully constructed barrier. "His car," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. "We had an anonymous tip, a week into the investigation. A woman called from a payphone, said she saw a green sedan near the woods by the academy that night. Said she saw a girl arguing with a boy, saw him push her inside. But the line went dead before she could give more details. We checked with every registered owner of a green sedan in a 50-mile radius. Harrison Blackwell's was on the list. We paid him a visit." Frank leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists. "And he was the perfect gentleman," Miller said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Invited us in, offered US coffee, said his car had been in the garage at his estate all evening. His mechanic, his wife, his house staff, they all backed him up. He expressed his deepest sympathies, said he'd pray for Leanne's safe return. He was convincing. He was a pillar of the community. We were just two small-town cops. We had nothing but a vague, anonymous tip. It went nowhere." "He lied," Frank said. "They all lied. This picture proves it. He was there." A heavy silence fell over the room. The weight of 22 years, of a justice denied, of a father's unending nightmare, settled between them. "What do you want from me, Frank?" Miller finally asked, his voice raw. "I'm retired. I have no badge, no authority. Blackwell is a federal judge. He's not just a pillar of the community anymore, he's the whole damn temple. You go against him with a grainy old photograph, he'll crush you. He'll call you a grieving, delusional father. He'll ruin you." "I am a grieving, delusional father," Frank said, his eyes locking with Miller's. "I've got nothing left to lose, but you. You have a conscience. And I know this case has been eating you alive for as long as it's been eating me. I need your help, Jim. I need the cop you used to be, before they broke you." Miller looked away, towards the stacks of cold cases that littered his home, each one a monument to his failures. He had let this go. He had believed the lies, accepted the wall, and moved on to the next tragedy. But the proof was right there, on his coffee table, in a high school yearbook. The ghost he could never shake was finally talking, and she was telling him he had failed her. "There was someone else," Miller said suddenly, his eyes sharp again. "Leanne's best friend. The one who found her books by the side of the road the next day. Sarah Jenkins. We interviewed her. She was a wreck. Terrified. Said she didn't know anything. That she and Leanne had a small fight that day and she hadn't seen her after school. We always felt she was holding something back. But we couldn't push. She was just a kid. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. Sarah Jenkins. He remembered a shy, quiet girl with big, fearful eyes who used to come over for sleepovers. Leanne had been her protector. Where is she now? Frank asked. Still here, Miller said, a grim little smile touching his lips. Never left. Works at the town library. Fitting, I guess. She spent her whole life surrounded by stories. Too afraid to tell her own. The library was an old stone building, a tomb of silence in the center of town. Frank walked through the doors, the scent of books, a sudden, sharp reminder of Leanne, who had consumed them like air. He found Sarah Jenkins in the local history section, stamping books with a mechanical, joyless precision. She had not aged well. The fear in her eyes, which had been a temporary state in girlhood, had become a permanent feature of her face. She was thin and hunched, as if perpetually bracing for a blow. She wore a cardigan sweater, despite the warmth of the day, a shield against a world she found too harsh. Sarah, Frank said softly. Her head snapped up, and the book she was holding fell to the floor with a loud bang. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with a panicked recognition that was 22 years old. Mr. Carver, she stammered, bending to retrieve the book, her hands trembling so badly she could barely pick it up. I didn't expect to see you. I need to ask you about Leanne, he said, getting straight to the point. There was no time for pleasantries. The color drained completely from her face. She looked around the empty aisle, as if expecting to see Blackwell's ghost materialize. From behind a shelf, I told the police everything I knew back then. It was so long ago, was it? Frank pressed, his voice gentle but firm. Some things don't feel like they were long ago, do they, Sarah? They feel like they happened yesterday. A tear welled in her eye and traced a path down her cheek. I can't what? Can't help, or can't keep lying. Frank took the yearbook from his bag and opened it to the debate club photo. He didn't show her the background. He just pointed to Leanne. She trusted you, Sarah. You were her best friend, her sister. She was writing an article, wasn't she? About Marcus Blackwell. Sarah flinched as if he'd struck her. She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. No, I don't know anything about an article. We were just kids. We talked about boys, and homework, and stupid things. This wasn't stupid, Frank insisted, his voice rising in intensity. This was about Marcus hurting someone, wasn't it? Another girl. That's what the article was about. Leanne was going to expose him. He was guessing, extrapolating from the fragments he remembered, but he saw from the terror in Sarah's eyes that he'd hit the mark. Her carefully constructed wall of silence was beginning to crumble. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice choked with a fear that was ancient and profound. You can't understand what they're like, the power they have. He'll know. If I talk, he'll know. Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. Marcus or his father? Sarah just stared at him, her entire body trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just shook her head again, grabbed her cart of books, and fled down the aisle, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. A ghost retreating back into the shadows. Frank watched her go, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. She was the key. She had been there that night, or she had seen something. The fight she'd told the police about wasn't a small teenage squabble. It was something much bigger. And her fear wasn't just the memory of a traumatized teenager. It was the fresh, palpable terror of a woman who knew the monster was still out there. He left the library and went home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple. That night, as he lay in his empty bed, the phone rang. It was an unlisted number, he answered. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice, smooth as polished granite, cold as a tombstone. Mr. Carver, this is Judge Blackwell. Frank's blood ran cold. Some advice, from one father to another, the judge continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Let sleeping dogs lie. You're only hurting yourself by digging up the past. Let your daughter rest in peace. It wasn't advice. It was a threat, and it confirmed everything. "She's not at peace," Frank said, his voice a low growl, "and she won't be. Not until the truth comes out." There was a soft, chilling chuckle on the other end of the line. "The truth is what I say it is, Mr. Carver. It always has been. Don't make me say it again." The line went dead. Frank stood in the darkness, the receiver still pressed to his ear, his knuckles white. The beast had been poked, and now it was awake. The fight had begun. The judge's call was a declaration of war. The next day, Frank received a letter from the town council regarding a zoning violation for the small workshop attached to his house, the same workshop that had stood there for 50 years, an anonymous complaint, they said. Then Miller called, his voice tight with anger. His pension paperwork had been misplaced, putting his monthly check on indefinite hold. A clerical error, they claimed. It was a classic Blackwell move. Not a direct assault, but a slow bureaucratic strangulation, designed to bleed them dry and break their will. They were flies caught in a web-spun of money and influence. Every direction they turned, they felt the invisible, sticky threads of the judge's power. "He's trying to scare us off," Miller said, pacing Frank's small living room. "He's reminding us that he controls the board." "It's not working," Frank said, though a cold knot of fear had settled in his gut. He looked at the yearbook, still open on his coffee table. Leanne's defiant face seemed to challenge him. "It's making me angry. We need more than the photo. We need Sarah." But Sarah was unreachable. Frank had gone back to the library, but she'd taken an indefinite leave of absence. Her phone was disconnected. She had gone to ground, buried herself even deeper in her fear. "If we can't get to her, maybe we can get to someone else," Miller mused, his old cop brain clicking. "Away. What about the girlfriend? The alibi, Tiffany. What was her last name?" "Peterson," Frank remembered instantly. Tiffany Peterson. The quintessential Northgate princess, blonde and popular. Always attached to Marcus Blackwell's arm like a prize accessory. Miller got on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys with a surprising dexterity. "Let's see where life took the golden couple." He fell silent for a few minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. Well, he finally murmured. "This is interesting." He turned the laptop around. Tiffany Peterson was now Tiffany Dumont, married to a wealthy real estate developer in a gated community 2 counties over. But it was Marcus who was the surprise. He wasn't a senator or a CEO. He was living in a modest condo back in their hometown, listed as a freelance consultant. He'd had 2 DUIs and a messy divorce. The golden boy's shine had definitely worn off. "He never left," Frank said, a strange feeling prickling his skin. "Why would he stay here, where everyone knows him?" "Maybe Daddy likes to keep him close," Miller grunted. On a leash, the idea of approaching Marcus was tempting, but dangerous. He was a cornered animal, and his father was the zookeeper. Tiffany, on the other hand, she was removed. She had a new life, a new name. Maybe, just maybe, her loyalty to the Blackwells had expired. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. The next day, Frank drove his old pickup truck to the opulent, sun-drenched enclave where Tiffany Dumont lived. The houses were sprawling, McMansions, the lawns a perfect, uniform green. It was a world away from his quiet, tree-lined street. He felt grubby and out of place, a ghost from a past Tiffany had clearly worked hard to escape. He found her by the pool, in her palatial backyard. A slim, tanned woman with expertly highlighted hair and the brittle, anxious energy of someone trying to hold it all together. She looked at him with a vague, polite confusion, the kind reserved for gardeners and delivery men. "Mrs. Dumont," Frank said. "My name is Frank Carver. I was Leanne Carver's father." The name hit her like a physical blow. The polite, masked cracked, and for a second, he saw the 17-year-old girl she'd been. Her eyes wide with a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Fear, guilt, yes. "I remember Leanne," she said, her voice a little too bright. "It was a terrible tragedy." She gestured vaguely to a patio chair. "What can I do for you, Mr. Carver?" It's been a very long time. I'm looking into what happened to her, Frank said, watching her carefully. New information has come to light. Tiffany's perfectly manicured hands tightened around the glass of iced tea she was holding. I don't see how I can help. I told the police everything back then. Marcus and I were together that night. Were you? Frank asked softly. Were you really with him the whole night, Tiffany? At the team dinner? Because I remember Leanne telling me you two had a big fight that week. She said you were thinking of breaking up with him. The memory was faint, just a fragment of a forgotten conversation, but it was enough. Tiffany's composure shattered. Her face crumpled, the carefully applied makeup suddenly looking like a cheap mask. He was difficult, she whispered, her eyes darting towards the house as if the judge himself might be listening. He had a temper. And his father protected him. No matter what he did, his father was always there to clean it up, to make it go away. What did he do, Tiffany? Frank pressed, his heart pounding. What did his father have to clean up? She shook her head, tears streaking her mascara. You don't know what you're getting into. Judge Blackwell is not someone you cross. He's a monster. A quiet, smiling monster. My daughter is gone, Frank said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. He took her from me. I have nothing left to be afraid of, but you. You got away. You have this beautiful house, a new life. You owe it to Leanne to tell the truth. You owe it to yourself. Tiffany stared into her iced tea, the condensation dripping onto the hot stone patio. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of birds and the hum of the pool filter. There was another girl, she finally said, her voice so low Frank had to lean in to hear. Before Leanne, her name was Emily. She was a sophomore, quiet girl, on scholarship, like Leanne, Marcus. He liked the ones who couldn't fight back. Her story came out in a torrent, a confession held back for 22 years. Marcus had cornered Emily at a party, gotten her drunk, hurt her. Emily had threatened to go to the principal. The next day, Judge Blackwell showed up at the school. He had a private meeting with Emily and her parents. The day after that, Emily's family packed up and moved out of state. They'd been paid off handsomely. The school records were wiped clean. It was as if Emily had never existed. Leanne found out about it. Tiffany wept. She was working on the school paper, doing a stupid article on school spirit or something. She started asking questions, talking to Emily's old friends. She was like a dog with a bone. I warned her. I told her to leave it alone, that she was playing with fire. Marcus told her to leave it alone. He cornered her in the hallway one day. I saw it. He grabbed her arm, and he had this look in his eyes. I'd never seen him look so scared, or so angry. And the night she disappeared, Frank prompted, gently, the alibi. Tiffany let out a bitter, self-loathing laugh. Alibi. I hadn't spoken to him in 2 days. He called me late that night, around 11. He was frantic. He said he needed me to do something for him, for his father. He told me to say we were at the movies, then the team dinner. He fed me the whole story, every detail. His father got on the line then, Judge Blackwell. He was so calm. He told me I was a good girl, a smart girl, and that being a friend to the Blackwell family would be very rewarding. He said Leanne had run away, that she was a troubled, dramatic girl, and that the police would be asking questions to tarnish the school's good name. He made it sound like I was doing a civic duty. She looked up at Frank, her eyes hollow with shame. I was 17. I was terrified. He was the most powerful man I'd ever met. I did what he told me to do. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture of unimaginable darkness. Leanne hadn't just stumbled onto a story of a boy's transgression. She had stumbled onto the conspiracy to cover it up, a conspiracy orchestrated by a man who believed he was above the law. She hadn't been a target for Marcus, she had been a threat to his father. Thank you, Tiffany, Frank said, his voice hoarse. It was more than he could have hoped for. It was motive. It was the why. He drove back to Miller's house, his mind racing. They had the photo, they had the motive, they had a broken alibi. But it was still just his word, and the word of a scared woman, against a federal judge. It wasn't enough to bring to the police, not yet. They would be laughed out of the station. And Blackwell would come down on them with the full force of his power. "We still need Sarah," Miller said grimly. After Frank recounted the conversation with Tiffany, "She's the only one who can place Leanne with Marcus that night. She's the eyewitness. Without her, this is all just hearsay and circumstantial evidence from 2 decades ago." But Sarah was gone. They had hit another wall, and this one felt just as high, just as solid as the first. Frank felt a wave of despair wash over him. They were so close, yet so far. He went home and paced the floors of his silent house, the judge's threat echoing in his ears. Let sleeping dogs lie. He picked up the yearbook again, his gaze falling on Leanne. Her expression seemed to have changed. The defiance was still there, but now he saw something else behind it. A glint of fear. She knew she was in danger. He remembered her in the weeks before she disappeared. She'd been jumpy, secretive. She'd bought a new cassette player, a small, handheld Sony, and was constantly listening to it with headphones, making notes in a little spiral-bound notebook. He'd asked her about it, and she'd just said it was for her oral history project for the newspaper. He hadn't thought anything of it. A cassette player, an oral history project. A cold jolt went through him. What if it wasn't for an oral history project? What if she wasn't just listening? What if she was recording? The thought was so electrifying, he felt his whole body tremble. Leanne, the dogged young reporter, armed with more than just questions. Leanne, creating evidence. But where would it be? The police had cleared out her room. They'd given him boxes of her belongings. He'd gone through them 100 times, but maybe he'd missed something. He flew up the stairs to the attic, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tore through the boxes marked Leanne, his hands clumsy with a desperate, burgeoning hope. Clothes, books, stuffed animals, diaries filled with teenage angst and poetry. Nothing. He sank back on his heels, defeated. It had been a foolish idea. A desperate fantasy. Of course, there was no tape. Then his eyes fell on a small wooden box in the corner. It was a music box he'd given her for her 16th birthday. It played a tinny version of Memory from the musical Cats, which she had adored. He'd barely glanced at it, dismissing it as just another childhood trinket. He picked it up. The wood was smooth beneath his fingers. He opened the lid. The small ballerina didn't turn. The mechanism was broken, but underneath the velvet lining, his fingers felt something hard and rectangular. His breath caught. Slowly, carefully, he pulled back the worn velvet, and there it was, a single cassette tape. On the label, in Leanne's neat, determined handwriting, were 2 words, Blackwell Project. For a moment, Frank just stared at it. This impossible artifact from a lost world. It was a message in a bottle, a voice from the grave. This was it. This was the hidden clue, the forgotten key. This was the bomb that could blow the Blackwell dynasty apart. But he had no cassette player. He practically ran to his truck. The tape clutched in his hand like a holy relic, and sped towards the only place he could think of that might still traffic in such ancient technology. The local Radio Shack, a dusty dinosaur of a store run by a man even older than he was. He bought the first portable player he saw, his hands shaking as he paid the clerk. He didn't wait until he got home. He sat in his truck in the parking lot, the setting sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. With trembling fingers, he opened the cassette player, inserted the tape, and put on the cheap foam headphones. He pressed play. There was a hiss of static, the sound of a tape being handled. Then, a voice, Leanne's voice. Young, clear, and full of a nervous energy. Okay, testing. May 19th, 1990. This is for the project. Frank's eyes squeezed shut. A tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. It was her. She was here, in his ears, alive for a precious, fleeting moment. The tape continued. It was a collage of clandestine recordings. A hushed conversation in a hallway with a girl who must have been one of Emily's friends, describing Marcus's aggression. A clipped, angry exchange between Marcus and Tiffany, her voice pleading, his sharp and dismissive. Leanne was building her case, piece by piece. Her voice occasionally interjecting with soft-spoken notes to herself. "He's getting nervous," she whispered on the tape. "He knows I'm asking questions. Tiffany warned me again today. She's terrified of his father." Then, the tape changed. The ambient sound was different. It was outdoors. The chirping of crickets. A car door slamming. A new voice. "Sarah Jenkins." "Lee, you can't do this," Sarah's voice pleaded, high and thin, with fear. "This is insane. Just drop it, please. He'll hurt you." "He already hurt Emily," Leanne's voice replied, steely and resolute. "And he got away with it. His father just waved his magic wand and made it disappear. It's not right. Sarah, someone has to make them accountable. We're 17. We're not crime fighters. What if he comes after us?" "That's why I have this," Leanne said, and Frank could hear the rustle of the recorder being adjusted. "Insurance, now go. I have to meet him. He said he'd talk to me, explain everything about Emily. He said he wanted to make it right." "It's a trap, Leanne," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "I'll be fine. I'll meet you back at my place in an hour." There was the sound of footsteps receding. Then, silence. A long, terrifying silence filled only with the sound of crickets. Frank held his breath, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. A car pulled up. A door opened. Marcus Blackwell's voice, slick and condescending. Well, little Miss Reporter. Got your notepad ready? Where's Emily, Marcus?" Leanne asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Emily's fine, she's better off. My father took care of her family. He takes care of everyone. That's not taking care of them, that's buying their silence. You hurt her, she wanted it," Marcus sneered. "They all do. You know you're brave, I'll give you that. Stupid, but brave." There was a scuffling sound. "Get off me." Leanne's voice, sharp with panic. "You should have listened to Tiffany. You should have left it alone." The sound of a struggle. A car door slamming shut, and then, a new voice. A voice that Frank had heard on the phone just nights before. A voice of calm, chilling authority that froze the blood in his veins. "Marcus, that's enough." It was Judge Harrison Blackwell. "Dad." Marcus sounded surprised, almost scared. "What are you doing here?" "Cleaning up your mess." "Again," the judge said, his voice laced with icy disappointment. "Get in the back of the car. Give me the girl's bag." A pause. "What is this?" "A tape recorder." "For God's sake, Marcus, are you that inept? Did you even check?" "I didn't know." "You never know," the judge sighed. Then his voice turned directly towards the recorder, towards Leanne, towards Frank, 22 years in the future. "Miss Carver, it seems you've gotten yourself into a situation you can't handle. You're a bright girl, too bright for your own good. You're going to take a little trip. And when you come back, you will have forgotten all about this project. You will transfer to a new school, and you will never ever speak of the Blackwell family again. Do you understand me?" There was no reply from Leanne, just the sound of a sharp, terrified inhale. The tape hissed for another 10 seconds, then clicked off. Frank ripped the headphones off, his body slick with a cold sweat. He was gasping for air, his heart feeling like it was going to explode out of his chest. It was all there. The confrontation, the kidnapping, the cover-up, confessed in the perpetrator's own voice. Leanne hadn't just recorded the lead-up. She had recorded her own abduction. She had captured the monster himself, red-handed. He looked at the cassette in his hand. This small piece of plastic and magnetic tape was dynamite. It wasn't just evidence against Marcus anymore. It was the judge, on tape, admitting to everything. He called Miller, his voice shaking. "I have it, Jim. I have it all. He's on tape." The judge himself. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Where are you?" Miller finally asked, his voice tight. "Parking lot, Radio Shack." "Go home, Frank. Lock your doors. Don't talk to anyone. I'm on my way." The next few hours were a blur. Miller arrived, his face grim. They listened to the tape together, the air in Frank's small house growing thick with the horror of it all. This was the smoking gun. This was the justice Leanne had died for. This changes everything, Miller said, his eyes gleaming with a light Frank hadn't seen in years. The light of a cop who finally has his man. This isn't for the local PD, they're in Blackwell's pocket. This is for the state police. For the Attorney General. Hell, for the FBI. This is a federal judge confessing to kidnapping and obstruction of justice. But first, they needed Sarah. The tape confirmed her presence at the scene right before the abduction. Her testimony was the final, crucial piece. She could put the tape in context, verify the voices, and describe Leanne's state of mind. They had to find her. They found her hiding in a cheap motel, a town over, registered under a false name. Miller had used some old-school cop connections, a favor called in from a lifetime on the force. When they knocked on the door, she opened it and just stared at them, her face a mask of gaunt resignation. She knew it was over. The running was done. She sat on the edge of the lumpy motel bed, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. Frank didn't show her the yearbook. He didn't need to. He held out the cassette player. Leanne recorded it. Sarah, he said softly. She recorded everything. We hear your voice. We hear you trying to save her. Sarah began to sob. Great racking sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being, a flood of grief and guilt held back for 22 years. I ran, she choked out between sobs. I heard the car pull up. I was hiding in the bushes. I saw them. I saw Marcus push her in, and then I saw his father's car right behind them. I saw the judge get out. I was so scared, I just ran. I left her there. I left her. You were a child, Frank said, his own voice thick. You did what a terrified child would do, but you're not a child anymore, Sarah, and we need you. Leanne needs you. One last time, he pressed play. They all listened as the ghosts of that May night filled the stale motel room. When it was over, Sarah was no longer crying. Her face was set, her eyes filled with a new, hard-won resolve. The fear was still there, but it was finally eclipsed by something else, the need for justice. The need to honor the friend she had abandoned. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice clear and steady for the first time. The plan was audacious, reckless, and utterly cinematic. It was Miller's idea, born of a career spent watching powerful men slip through the cracks of a system they had designed. Going through official channels would take months, years. It would give Blackwell time to bury them, to use his immense power to discredit the tape, to destroy their lives before the case ever saw a courtroom. We have to detonate it in public, Miller had said, his eyes wild with a dangerous fire. We have to expose him in a way he can't control. No lawyers, no backroom deals. Just him, the truth, and the whole world watching. The opportunity was perfect, almost poetic. In 3 days, Judge Harrison Blackwell was being honored at the annual Founders Gala, a black tie event celebrating Northgate Academy's most distinguished alumni. He was the keynote speaker. He would be on a stage, in front of every important person in the state, basking in the glow of a lifetime of curated respectability. It was there they would deliver his judgment. Getting in was the first hurdle. Miller called in the last, and most important favor of his career, to a state trooper he'd mentored years ago, a man who owed him his life. They secured 2 tickets and, more importantly, a schematic of the hotel ballroom's AV system. The next 72 hours were a fever dream of preparation. Frank, the meticulous watchmaker, and Miller, the grizzled detective, became a 2-man conspiracy. They transferred the audio from the cassette to a digital file, cleaning it up just enough to make the voices crisp and clear, the horror undiluted. Sarah, staying at Miller's house for her own safety, wrote out a sworn affidavit, her hand shaking but her narrative unwavering. The night of the gala arrived, cold and clear. Frank stood in front of the mirror in his only suit, a relic from his wedding that was now too big for his diminished frame. He looked like a ghost. But as he met his own eyes in the mirror, he saw Leanne's defiance, staring back at him. "I dare you." He and Miller walked into the opulent ballroom of the Grand Hotel. A world of champagne, chandeliers, and whispered power. The air was thick with perfume and self-congratulation. And there, at the head table, sat Judge Blackwell, laughing with the governor, the very picture of grace and power. He looked untouchable, a king in his court. Beside him sat Marcus, looking bloated and tired, a hollowed-out prince propped up by his father's reputation. Frank felt a surge of pure hatred, so intense, it made him dizzy. Miller put a steadying hand on his arm. "Not yet. Wait for the signal." Their plan was simple. Miller would use a fabricated bomb threat, called in at the precise moment, to draw the judge's personal security detail away from the stage. In the ensuing confusion, Frank, posing as a last-minute addition to the programmer grateful parent from the Academy's past, would take the podium. The AV tech, a young man whom Miller's contact had persuaded to help, would switch the audio input from the microphone to a laptop holding their digital file. They sat through the dinner, the food tasteless in Frank's mouth. They listened to the endless speeches, the fawning tributes to the judge's wisdom, his integrity, his charity. Frank's hand, in his pocket, was wrapped around a small remote that would start the audio file. Finally, the moment came. The master of ceremonies, a portly local news anchor, introduced the man of the hour. And now, a man who needs no introduction, a true pillar of our community, the Honorable Judge Harrison Blackwell. The room erupted in applause. The judge stood, beaming, soaking in the adoration. As he approached the podium, Miller discreetly slipped out of the ballroom, his cell phone to his ear. Frank watched the head table. A moment later, a man in a dark suit leaned in and whispered urgently in the judge's ear. The judge's smile faltered for a second. He waved the security man away, an arrogant flick of the wrist. But the seed of confusion had been planted. 2 more security men moved swiftly towards the exits. It was working. The MC stepped back to the microphone, his face flustered. "Ladies and gentlemen, a slight delay. In the meantime, we have a surprise. Addition, a parent who wishes to express his gratitude for the opportunities Northgate provided his family. Please welcome Mr. Frank Carver." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. "Who?" Frank stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and walked towards the stage. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, questioning his presence. He could feel the judge's eyes on him, a look of pure, murderous rage dawning on his face as he recognized the watchmaker from town. Frank reached the podium. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He looked out at the sea of blank, wealthy faces. He saw the AV tech in the back of the room give him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He leaned into the microphone. He didn't say a word. He just pressed the button in his pocket. For a second, there was only a hiss. The judge started to rise from his chair, signaling for security. But it was too late. Leanne's voice, young and clear, filled the grand ballroom. "Okay, testing. May 19th, 1990. A stunned silence fell over the room. The air crackled. The judge froze, his face a mask of disbelief. Marcus went white as a sheet. His glass of water slipping from his trembling hand and shattering on the floor. The tape played. The whole room listened, utterly captivated, as the story of the Blackwell project unfolded. They heard the whispers in the hallway, the argument between friends, the desperate pleas. They heard the crickets, the sound of a car door, the struggle. Every person in that room was transported back to that dark patch of woods. A silent witness to a 22-year-old crime, when the judge's voice finally came through the speakers, "Cleaning up your mess." Again, a collective gasp went through the audience. People turned to stare at the head table, their faces a mixture of horror and disgust. The man they had just been applauding was revealed for what he was. The king was naked, and his robes were stained with blood. Frank watched the judge's face. The mask of civility was gone, stripped away by a child's voice from the grave. All that was left was the raw, ugly face of a cornered animal. Panic, then fury, then a chilling, absolute certainty of his own ruin. The tape ended with the click of the recorder being shut off. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Frank had ever heard. It was a silence thick with judgment, with the weight of a truth finally, irrevocably exposed. Then, the main doors of the ballroom burst open. Not hotel security. State troopers, grim-faced and armed, their badges glinting under the chandeliers. They moved swiftly, purposefully, towards the head table. The spell was broken. The room erupted in a cacophony of shouts, of scraping chairs, of flashing cell phone cameras. It was chaos. It was a scandal breaking the internet in real time. It was justice. Marcus Blackwell crumpled, sobbing hysterically, a pathetic, broken man, but the judge, Harrison Blackwell, drew himself up to his full height. He straightened his tie, a final futile gesture of defiance. As the troopers slapped the handcuffs on his wrists, his eyes found Frank's across the ruined ballroom. There was no remorse in them, only a cold, bottomless hatred. Frank didn't flinch. He just stood there at the podium, his daughter's last words echoing in the air, a silent testament to a promise finally kept. The light had come in, and it had burned the whole damn temple to the ground. The aftermath was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the explosive finale at the gala. The legal proceedings were swift. Marcus, faced with the undeniable evidence of the tape and Sarah's testimony, confessed everything. He led the investigators to a patch of dense, forgotten woods behind the old academy grounds, to a place where the earth was disturbed. He had panicked, he claimed. Leanne had fought back in the car, tried to grab the tape recorder. He had put his hand over her mouth to silence her, and in the struggle, he had held on for too long. It was an accident, he sobbed. A terrible accident. His father had made him bury her. His father had planned it all. Judge Blackwell never confessed. He remained defiant to the end, a pillar of arrogance, even in a prison jumpsuit. But the tape was his undoing. He was convicted of kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and accessory to manslaughter. The untouchable man was finally touched. They held a memorial for Leanne in the town square. It was a simple service. The whole town came, their faces etched with a collective shame for having looked away for so long. Sarah Jenkins stood beside Frank, no longer a ghost in a library, but a woman standing in the sun, her head held high. Tiffany Dumont was there too, standing quietly at the back, her tears looking real for the first time. Even old Miller stood with Frank, a quiet sense of peace on his weathered face. The cold case that had haunted his life was finally closed. Later, Frank drove out to the small cemetery on the hill. He stood before a new stone, simple and clean. Leanne Carver, 197-1990. A voice that would not be Esilean Sihend. He laid a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. He didn't weep. His tears had all been spent over the long, silent years. What he felt instead was a profound, aching, quiet. The roaring in his head, the constant gnawing question that had been his companion for 2 decades, was finally gone. There was only silence. A peaceful silence. He thought about the yearbook, now a piece of evidence in a sealed police locker. He thought about that single, grainy photograph. It was a fluke of light, a 1,000,000-to-1 accident of optics and timing. A reflection in a window that had held a secret for 22 years. It had waited patiently in the dark, in an attic, in a box full of memories. For a father's grief to finally be sharp enough to see. It was a reminder, he thought, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gravestone. A reminder that evil often wears a smiling, respectable mask. It thrives in the shadows of power and influence. Confident that no one is looking closely enough to see the truth. But sometimes, all it takes is one person. One person, broken and armed with nothing but love and a watchmaker's eye, to finally let the light in. He traced the letters of his daughter's name on the cool stone. He had his answer. He had her back. He could finally let her rest. And, perhaps, he could begin to rest, too.